So guys, this is American History class, chapter 17, lesson 1. And I'm going to do it just like we normally would if you were here. I'm going to go through it, explain it, and highlight the key parts. So this is chapter 17, lesson 1, should be day 1 of your packets. So Abraham Lincoln is beginning his second term as president right as the Civil War is ending. And in his speech, he says that he wants to rebuild the country. He wants all Americans to forget the war as soon as possible, and he wants them to move on. So he puts a plan together to rebuild the nation. His plan said the seceded states, the red ones on that map you guys did, they could rejoin the Union when 10% of its voters took an oath, or they promised to support the Union and follow the rules and obey the ban on slavery. He also offers amnesty or pardons to the Southerners. If you guys remember, a pardon is when you are forgiven of your crimes. So he's saying that people who broke the law during the Civil War, they will not be punished for it. The main reason he did this is so they would rejoin the country as quickly as possible. Now that the war is over, he wants to put the two pieces back together and be done with it. New state governments would form, but they would have to obey the ban on slavery. Lincoln knew that a lot of people in Congress did not agree with his plan, but since he was the president, he thought he could proceed without their approval. Leave that up there for a second. Okay, so on April 14th, Abe Lincoln decides to take a break and relax for a little bit, and he goes to see a play. And it was a much different time back then. They did not have Secret Service to protect him 24 hours a day like they do today. So a guy named John Wilkes Booth, he was from the South. He goes in and he's able to get right up to the balcony where the president is, and he pulls out a small Derringer pistol and shoots the president in the head. Lincoln dies the next morning from his wounds. A few days after he assassinates Abe Lincoln, they find John Wilkes Booth and he is killed as well. So he did not live long enough to see the country get put back together successfully. And when the president dies, the vice president has to step up. So in the South, things were demolished. Things were completely destroyed. We talked about how General Grant and General Sherman went and burned things down. They burned the farms, they burned the bridges, they destroyed the railroads, and the South was completely destroyed. Another thing that's going to make this hard is the Confederates, or the South, was using their own money during this war. But since they lost the war, all of that money was now worthless. That would be like if you bought a bunch of gift certificates for a restaurant, your brand new favorite restaurant, and that restaurant goes out of business. Those certificates are now worth nothing. The same thing happened to their money. So these people who used to be rich, now they are completely broke. They cannot afford to rebuild. A lot of the banks also closed because they supported the Confederacy. They were full of Confederate money, and that money is now garbage. It's gone. So all this damage to the South is going to make it very hard to rebuild. And once the Civil War ends, the South is a very hard place to keep in order. There's no police, there's no judges. Some people are trying to take the law into their own hands, but it's very hard to keep things calm. Some of the people most hurt by this are going to be the former slaves, because they used to be slaves and now they are set free, which is good. But they're set free and they have nowhere to go. They have nowhere to work, and if anyone's going to hire them, they're not going to pay them fairly or treat them fairly. So a lot of these former slaves are now free, but they are struggling. So once Abe Lincoln has died, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, has to become the new president. And it's a weird situation because Abe Lincoln was a Republican and Andrew Johnson was a Democrat, which means they are opposite teams. The reason why Abe Lincoln chose Andrew Johnson to be his vice president is because he knew he had to put the country back together. Nobody ever expected Andrew Johnson to be actually in charge of the country. Andrew Johnson was a Democrat. He was from Tennessee. He's from the South. He'd been a senator when the war started, but he remained loyal to the Union even though he was from the South. President Johnson tries to follow Lincoln's Reconstruction plan, but a lot of people criticize the way he follows it. He pardons pretty much all the Southerners who promise they're going to act right. He puts temporary people in charge, temporary governors, to try to help get the government set back up in the South, and he wants them to elect new representatives in Congress. So he's trying to fix things, but he might not be doing the best approach. So within a few months, most of the states had ratified the 13th Amendment. Ratified means to pass or approve of, and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, which means they completely got rid of it. By the end of 1865, Andrew Johnson announced that all of the southern states but Texas were allowed to rejoin the Union. Congress does not agree. A lot of people in Congress think that the South has not learned their lesson yet. There's people in Congress called radical Republicans, and they are against the Reconstruction plan. They want to punish the South for starting the Civil War. They think they should have to pay for the damages they caused. So they did not accept these states back into the Union, and they refused to recognize anyone who was elected into these southern states. Some people down south, proving the radical Republicans' points, had not learned. So they started passing these laws called black codes. And black codes are laws that only apply to African Americans. And what the black codes did is it made it so former slaves, now called freedmen, were not allowed to vote. They were not allowed to own certain property, and they weren't allowed to have any job that paid them well. So as you guys can see, the South really didn't learn their lesson, and they didn't intend on changing. They were still discriminating and treating the black people unfairly. Okay, guys. If you have any questions, you can